You don't get to do this.
Oh, I think I do.
He is my son.
I've built empires, but still, I can't solve this. What comes next?
This piece goes here. Perfect. Now, let's see how much power this generates.
Open it. No. It's time.
I want to be an engineer and build bridges like this.
That's a wonderful dream. I think you'll do great things.
We are so happy you're here, my darling. Me too, grandmother.
Welcome home, son.
Sometimes, the people who reject a child the fastest are the ones who owe that child the truth. On a warm Saturday evening in downtown Chicago, the Grant family was hosting one of the most exclusive birthday celebrations of the year. Luxury cars lined the circular driveway of the historic Grant estate. Valets moved quickly between guests dressed in designer suits and elegant evening gowns. Crystal chandeliers glowed through the mansion's towering windows, while a live jazz band played beneath a white tent overlooking 3 acres of perfectly manicured lawns. It was the 72nd birthday of Victoria Grant, the matriarch of one of the wealthiest families in Illinois, and nearly everyone who mattered in business, politics, and high society had received an invitation. 9-year-old Malik Carter stood quietly near the entrance gate, holding his mother's hand. His clean blue button-down shirt had been carefully pressed that morning, and his sneakers were spotless despite being several months old. Beside him, Jasmine Carter took a deep breath and looked toward the mansion. She had spent nearly a decade preparing herself for this moment. She wasn't there for money. She wasn't there for fame. She was there because her son deserved answers. Malik looked up at her. "Mom, are you sure they want us here?" he asked softly. Jasmine forced a smile she didn't completely feel. "We're just here to tell the truth, sweetheart." Before they could take another step forward, a staff member approached and asked for their invitation. Jasmine explained that she needed to speak with Victoria Grant personally. The employee disappeared inside. Several minutes later, Victoria herself emerged from the grand entrance, surrounded by relatives and guests. The crowd naturally parted to make room for her. Her silver necklace sparkled beneath the estate lights as she walked toward Jasmine and Malik with a look of irritation rather than curiosity. The music continued in the background, but nearby conversations slowly faded as guests sensed something unusual unfolding. Victoria's eyes moved from Jasmine to Malik. The moment she saw the boy, her expression hardened. Jasmine introduced herself calmly and explained that she needed to discuss something important regarding Alexander Grant. A few whispers immediately spread through the crowd. Alexander Grant, Victoria's son, was a billionaire technology entrepreneur whose name appeared regularly on financial news channels. He was currently overseas attending meetings in Singapore and had no idea what was happening at that moment. Victoria listened for only a few seconds before raising her hand. "I've heard enough," she said coldly. Jasmine tried again. She explained that she had known Alexander years earlier and that Malik deserved the chance to be acknowledged. More guests began watching openly now. Phones remained in pockets, but every eye was fixed on the growing tension. Victoria stared directly at the child. Malik shifted closer to his mother. Then came the sentence that would change everything. "That boy will never carry the Grant name," Victoria declared loudly enough for dozens of guests to hear. A stunned silence followed. Malik didn't fully understand why everyone was staring at him, but he understood enough to know he wasn't welcome. Jasmine's face tightened, though she refused to argue. Victoria instructed the staff to escort them away from the celebration and return the evening to its guests. As Jasmine gently guided her son back toward the gate, whispers erupted throughout the crowd. Some assumed she was chasing wealth. Others wondered if there was more to the story. But none of them noticed the one thing that would have made them question everything. As Malik glanced back one final time, the lights from the mansion illuminated his face. And for a brief second, anyone who had ever seen a childhood photo of Alexander Grant would have noticed the resemblance immediately. The ride home felt much longer than the 12 miles between the Grant estate and Jasmine's apartment on the south side of Chicago. Streetlights passed across the windshield as Malik sat quietly in the back seat, staring out the window. Jasmine could see his reflection every time they stopped at a red light. Usually he was full of questions, full of energy, full of stories about school or basketball or whatever book he happened to be reading that week. Tonight he barely spoke. After several minutes, his small voice finally broke the silence. "Mom, why did that lady seem so angry at me?" Jasmine tightened her grip on the steering wheel. She had prepared herself for rejection. She had prepared herself for humiliation. What she had never prepared for was having to explain it to her son. "She was not angry at you," Jasmine said carefully. "Sometimes people make decisions before they know the whole story." Malik nodded but did not look convinced. Back at their apartment building, Jasmine unlocked the door and switched on the kitchen light. The apartment was modest but warm. Family photos covered one wall. School certificates hung proudly beside them. Malik dropped his backpack beside the couch and disappeared into his room without another word. Jasmine stood alone in the kitchen and exhaled slowly. For years she had debated whether she should ever contact the Grant family. She had delayed the decision again and again, hoping that somehow the truth would find its own way to the people who needed to hear it. But time kept moving. Malik was growing older. Questions were becoming harder to answer. Across the world, nearly 8,000 miles away, Alexander Grant stepped into a private conference room overlooking Singapore's Marina Bay. The 38-year-old billionaire had spent the last 3 days negotiating a major international technology partnership. His schedule was packed from sunrise until late evening. As he reviewed financial reports, his phone vibrated repeatedly with messages from family members back in Chicago. At first, he ignored them. Family group chats were usually filled with birthday photos and harmless updates. But when he finally opened the messages, he noticed something unusual. Several relatives were discussing an unexpected incident at Victoria's birthday party. A woman had arrived claiming to have important information about him. Some family members dismissed her as an opportunist. Others seemed uncertain. One message caught his attention. An older cousin wrote, "The boy looked strangely familiar." Alexander frowned. Before he could ask for details, another meeting began and his attention shifted elsewhere. Meanwhile, back in Chicago, rumors from the party continued spreading through social circles. Guests shared different versions of what had happened. Some insisted Jasmine had come seeking money. Others questioned why she had remained calm even after being publicly rejected. One guest remembered seeing tears in the boy's eyes. Another remembered something different. He remembered the child's face. Later that night, a professional photographer hired for the birthday celebration uploaded hundreds of event photos into a private family gallery. Most images showed smiling guests, elegant decorations, and expensive gifts. Hidden among them was a photograph taken near the front gate just before Jasmine and Malik left. In the image, Malik had turned slightly toward the camera. Hours later, one family member paused while scrolling through the gallery. He enlarged the photograph and stared. Then he opened another image from years earlier, a childhood portrait of Alexander Grant. The similarities were impossible to ignore. For the first time, someone inside the Grant family began wondering whether Victoria had made a terrible mistake. 3 days later, Alexander Grant landed at O'Hare International Airport under gray Chicago skies. His schedule had been rearranged twice during the flight because of urgent business matters. Yet the strange messages from his family continued occupying a corner of his mind. By the time his driver pulled onto Lake Shore Drive, he had already received 3 separate texts mentioning the same incident: a woman, a child, a confrontation at his mother's birthday celebration, and most curious of all, repeated comments about the boy's resemblance to him. Alexander was not someone who believed in coincidence. His success had been built on paying attention to details other people overlooked. When he arrived at his downtown office overlooking the Chicago River, he immediately called his cousin Richard, the same relative who had mentioned the resemblance. "Tell me exactly what happened," Alexander said. Richard hesitated before explaining everything he had witnessed. He described Jasmine. Arriving calmly, Malik standing quietly beside her, and Victoria refusing to hear more than a few sentences before dismissing them. Richard also mentioned the photograph from the party gallery. After ending the call, Alexander opened the image on his computer screen. For several seconds, he simply stared. He could not explain why, but something about the boy's eyes caught his attention immediately. It was not merely physical resemblance. It was familiarity, a feeling he could not shake. Later that afternoon, Alexander drove to his mother's estate. Victoria welcomed him warmly at first, but her expression changed the moment he mentioned Jasmine Carter. "That matter is finished," she said sharply. "You should not waste another second thinking about it." Alexander frowned. Why was she there? Victoria crossed her arms. "Because some people see a successful family and imagine opportunity." "Did you let her explain?" Alexander asked. There was nothing to explain. The conversation ended there, but the exchange left Alexander more suspicious than reassured. His mother usually had answers for everything. This time she seemed determined to avoid the subject altogether. That evening, while reviewing old business files at home, Alexander found himself distracted. Finally, he opened the photograph again. Malik's face appeared on the screen. Alexander enlarged the image. Then something unexpected happened. He remembered a photograph from his own childhood. He walked into a storage room and searched through several boxes until he found an old family album. Flipping through yellowed pages, he stopped at a picture taken when he was about 9 years old. For a moment his breath caught. The similarities were difficult to ignore. The same smile, the same shape of the eyes, even a similar expression whenever they looked slightly uncomfortable in front of a camera. Rationally, Alexander knew resemblance alone proved nothing. Yet the feeling remained. The next morning he asked his executive assistant to locate any available public information regarding Jasmine Carter. Within hours a report appeared on his desk. What he found surprised him. Jasmine had no history of lawsuits, no record of financial claims against wealthy individuals, no interviews, no social media campaign, no attempts to contact the press after the incident. In fact, she appeared to have spent years quietly raising her son while working 2 jobs. None of it matched the story he had been told. As Alexander closed the report, another detail stood out. According to employment records, Jasmine had worked at a charity fundraiser 9 years earlier. Alexander had attended that same event. Suddenly, what seemed impossible a week ago no longer felt impossible at all. And for the first time, Alexander began wondering whether someone had hidden an important truth from him for nearly a decade. 2 days later, Alexander found himself unable to focus on quarterly reports, investor presentations, or acquisition meetings. Every time he tried to return to work, his thoughts drifted back to the same questions. Why had Jasmine waited so many years? Why had she never contacted the media? And why had his mother reacted with such unusual hostility? Late Friday afternoon, Alexander left his office earlier than planned. Instead of heading home, he drove across the city toward a community center on the south side where one of the Grant Foundation's educational programs was hosting a youth event. He had agreed months earlier to make a brief appearance and hand out academic awards. Normally, he would have sent a representative. Today, he welcomed the distraction. The gymnasium buzzed with activity as dozens of children participated in science exhibits, reading competitions, and basketball clinics. Parents sat in folding chairs along the sidelines while volunteers moved between booths. Alexander spent nearly an hour greeting families and posing for photographs. Then, while speaking with a program coordinator, he noticed a familiar face near one of the tables. A boy was carefully assembling a small model bridge from wooden sticks and glue. Alexander froze. It was Malik. The boy did not notice him at first. He was completely focused on his project. Several children nearby had already given up after their structures collapsed. But Malik patiently adjusted each piece and started over whenever something failed. The coordinator smiled. "That kid has been here every week for almost 2 years," she said. "One of the hardest working children we have." Alexander watched quietly. A few moments later, Another child accidentally bumped the table, causing part of the bridge to fall apart. Instead of getting angry, Malik simply smiled and began rebuilding it. The reaction triggered an unexpected memory. When Alexander was 9 years old, he had entered a school engineering contest. His project had collapsed minutes before judging. While other students cried or quit, he had calmly started again. His father used to tell that story at family gatherings. Very few people knew it. The similarity unsettled him. Then something even stranger happened. Malik finally looked up and saw Alexander standing across the room. For a brief second, neither of them spoke. The boy's eyes widened with recognition. Not because he knew Alexander personally, but because everyone in Chicago knew who Alexander Grant was. "Mr. Grant?" Malik asked. Alexander walked over and smiled. "Looks like you are building something important." Malik glanced down at the bridge. "I want to be an engineer someday." Alexander nodded. "That is exactly what I wanted to be when I was your age." The words escaped before he could stop them. Both seemed surprised by the coincidence. They spent several minutes talking about school, books, and science projects. Alexander found himself genuinely enjoying the conversation. Malik was polite, intelligent, and remarkably mature for his age. There was no sign of entitlement, no sign of someone being coached to chase wealth. When the event ended, Jasmine entered the gymnasium to pick up her son. The moment she saw Alexander standing beside Malik, she stopped. Shock crossed her face. Alexander noticed it immediately. For several seconds, neither adult spoke. Then Jasmine gently placed a hand on her son's shoulder. "Come on, sweetheart. We should go." Before leaving, Malik turned back toward Alexander. "It was nice meeting you, sir." Alexander watched them walk away. As they disappeared through the exit doors, a feeling settled over him that he could no longer ignore. For the first time since this mystery began, he was no longer looking at a photograph. He had met the boy himself, and now the questions were becoming impossible to dismiss. That night, Alexander sat alone in his penthouse overlooking the Chicago skyline. The city lights stretched for miles beyond the glass walls, but his attention remained fixed on a single question. What if everyone had been wrong? For years, he had trusted that the people closest to him would always tell him the truth. Yet the more he learned about Jasmine Carter and her son, the less sense the entire situation made. Early the next morning, Alexander called Michael Reynolds, a retired attorney who had served as legal counsel to the Grant family for more than 20 years. If anyone knew details about the past, it would be him. They met at a quiet coffee shop away from downtown. At first, Michael seemed uncomfortable when Alexander mentioned Jasmine's name. That reaction alone raised alarms. "Do you know something?" Alexander asked. Michael stared into his coffee before finally answering. "There are things I always assumed your mother told you herself." Alexander felt his stomach tighten. "What things?" Michael sighed. "About 9 years ago, a young woman tried several times to reach you." Alexander immediately leaned forward. "Jasmine." Michael nodded slowly. "I never met her personally, but I remember hearing discussions about letters, phone messages, and requests for meetings." Alexander sat frozen. "Why was I never told?" Michael hesitated. "I cannot answer that." For several seconds, neither man spoke. The noise of the coffee shop seemed to disappear. Alexander's mind raced through years of memories. Business trips, family gatherings, holidays. Not once had anyone mentioned repeated attempts to contact him. Not once. After leaving the meeting, Alexander drove directly to the Grant estate. He found Victoria sitting in her sunroom reading financial news reports. The moment she saw his expression, she knew something had changed. "Did Jasmine try to contact me years ago?" Alexander asked. Victoria slowly lowered the newspaper. "This conversation is unnecessary. Answer the question." Victoria remained silent. The silence itself felt like an answer. Alexander rarely lost his composure, but frustration began building inside him. "Did someone stop those messages from reaching me?" he asked. Victoria stood and walked toward the window. "I was protecting this family." Alexander stared at her. Protecting us from what? From uncertainty, she replied. From people who appear when success attracts attention. But her explanation sounded weaker than before. For the first time, Alexander noticed doubt in her voice. Meanwhile, across town, Jasmine was finishing a long shift at work when she received an unexpected phone call. The caller introduced himself as an executive assistant from Grant Technologies. Jasmine immediately assumed there had been some mistake. Then the assistant explained that Alexander Grant wanted to meet with her privately. Jasmine closed her eyes. For years she had imagined this moment. Yet instead of relief, she felt anxiety. Too much time had passed. Too much damage had already been done. That evening she sat beside Malik while he completed homework at the kitchen table. "Mom," he asked, "do you think Mr. Grant is a good person?" Jasmine paused before answering. "I think sometimes good people make decisions based on incomplete information." Malik considered that for a moment and returned to his schoolwork. What neither of them knew was that Alexander was beginning to uncover something even more disturbing than hidden letters. As he reviewed old family records late that night, he discovered evidence suggesting that someone had deliberately intercepted communications for months. Suddenly, this was no longer a misunderstanding. It was becoming a conspiracy that had lasted nearly a decade. The following Tuesday, Alexander arrived at a private conference room inside Grant Technologies nearly 30 minutes early. He rarely felt nervous before a meeting, but this one was different. Across the polished oak table sat years of unanswered questions. At exactly 10 o'clock, the door opened and Jasmine Carter stepped inside. She wore a simple navy blazer and carried no attorney, no reporters, and no demands. That fact alone told Alexander more than any background report ever could. For a few moments, they simply looked at each other. Nearly a decade of missed conversations filled the silence. Finally, Alexander spoke first. "Thank you for coming." Jasmine nodded politely. "Your assistant said this meeting was important." Alexander took a deep breath. "I need to know what happened 9 years ago." Jasmine lowered her eyes briefly before answering. "I tried to tell you." The words landed heavily between them. She explained how she had met Alexander at a charity fundraiser years earlier. Their connection had been brief but genuine. After learning she was pregnant, she had attempted to contact him multiple times. Letters had been sent. Messages had been left. Meetings had been requested. Yet every attempt seemed to disappear. Weeks became months. Months became years. Eventually she stopped believing he would ever know. Alexander listened without interruption. The more details she shared, the more closely they matched records he had recently uncovered. None of it sounded rehearsed. None of it sounded manipulative. It sounded like the truth. "Why come forward now?" he asked quietly. Jasmine looked directly at him. "Because Malik is getting older. He deserves answers. He deserves to know where he comes from." Alexander sat back in his chair. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine the possibility that everything she was saying might be real. The thought was overwhelming. Across town at that very moment, Malik sat in his classroom working on a science assignment. His class had been asked to create a family history project. Most students had already begun collecting photographs and stories from relatives. Malik stared at the nearly blank worksheet in front of him. One question stood out above all the others. Family medical history. He knew almost nothing about his father's side. Later that afternoon, when Jasmine picked him up from school, he seemed unusually quiet. Finally, he handed her the assignment. Jasmine read it and felt her heart sink. She knew they could not avoid the truth much longer. Meanwhile, Alexander remained in the conference room long after Jasmine left. He replayed every detail of the conversation. One sentence refused to leave his mind. Malik deserves answers. By evening, Alexander made a decision. Speculation was no longer enough. Resemblance was no longer enough. Old memories and hidden letters were no longer enough. There was only one way to determine the truth with certainty. He contacted a private medical laboratory and requested the most accurate legal DNA testing available. The appointment was scheduled immediately. Yet before the arrangements could move forward, news of Alexander's investigation somehow reached the Grant estate. When Victoria learned that a DNA test was being considered, her reaction shocked even longtime family members. For the first time since this began, she appeared genuinely afraid. The DNA appointment was scheduled for Friday morning at one of the most respected private laboratories in Chicago. The process itself would take less than an hour. The results would take several days. Yet those few days suddenly felt more important than any business negotiation Alexander Grant had ever faced. News of the upcoming test spread quietly through the Grant family. Some relatives supported it. Others preferred not to discuss it. Victoria Grant, however, became increasingly determined to stop it from happening. 2 days before the appointment, she requested a private meeting with Alexander at the family estate. The moment he entered her office, he sensed the tension. Victoria closed the door and looked directly at her son. "You are making a mistake," she said. Alexander remained calm. "If there is no truth to Jasmine's story, the test will prove it." Victoria shook her head. "Some questions are better left unanswered." The statement surprised him. "That is not how truth works," he replied. For several seconds, neither spoke. Finally, Victoria sat down and stared at the photographs lining her desk. "You have spent your entire life building something extraordinary," she said softly. "Do not let one unexpected claim change everything." Alexander listened carefully. Then he asked the question that had haunted him for weeks. "What are you really afraid of?" Victoria looked away. The silence that followed was longer than any answer. Meanwhile, Jasmine faced a difficult decision of her own. She had always promised herself that Malik's well-being would come before everything else. A DNA test could finally provide answers, but it could also bring enormous attention into their lives. That evening she sat with Malik at their kitchen table. The family history project from school remained unfinished beside him. "Mom," Malik asked quietly, "do you think I will ever know who my father is?" Jasmine felt her throat tighten. She reached across the table and gently held his hand. "I think we are closer to finding that answer than we have ever been." Malik nodded. He did not fully understand the complexity surrounding him, but he understood hope. On Friday morning, the laboratory arranged separate arrival times to protect everyone's privacy. Alexander arrived first. Jasmine and Malik entered through another entrance 15 minutes later. The atmosphere inside the facility was professional and calm. No reporters, no cameras, no family members, just medical staff and documentation specialists. When Alexander saw Malik enter the waiting area, something unexpected happened. The boy smiled and waved. It was a simple gesture, innocent, natural, yet it affected Alexander more than he expected. He smiled back. For a brief moment, the uncertainty disappeared, replaced by a strange sense of connection. The testing procedure itself was straightforward. Identification documents were verified. Samples were collected. Forms were signed. Less than 40 minutes later, everything was complete. As they prepared to leave, the laboratory director informed them that results would be available within several business days. Outside, dark clouds gathered over the city. Jasmine and Malik drove home. Alexander returned to his office. Everyone now faced the same waiting period. But that evening, an unexpected development changed everything. A longtime former employee of the Grant estate contacted Alexander's attorney and requested an urgent meeting. According to the message, she possessed information about what had happened 9 years earlier. Information that could explain exactly how Jasmine's attempts to reach Alexander had disappeared, and for the first time, someone was finally ready to tell the whole truth. 3 days later, the waiting finally ended. The official DNA results had arrived at the laboratory, but Alexander made a deliberate decision. He did not want the truth delivered through a phone call or an email. He wanted everyone most affected by the answer to hear it directly. A private meeting was arranged at the headquarters of Grant Technologies. Present in the room would be Alexander, Jasmine, Malik, the family's legal counsel, and several senior relatives who had become involved after the events at Victoria's birthday celebration. Even Victoria agreed to attend, although her expression throughout the morning suggested she would rather be anywhere else. The conference room occupied the top floor of the building and overlooked the Chicago skyline. Sunlight reflected off the glass towers outside as everyone slowly took their seats. Malik sat beside Jasmine, dressed neatly in a blue shirt and dark slacks. He looked nervous but composed. Alexander sat across from them. Every few seconds, his eyes drifted toward the boy, not because of resemblance anymore, because he realized how much depended on the next few minutes. The laboratory director arrived carrying a sealed envelope. The room immediately fell silent. No one spoke. No one checked a phone. Even the city noise beyond the windows seemed to disappear. The director placed the envelope on the table and verified the identities associated with the test. Once the formalities were complete, she carefully opened the document. Victoria lowered her eyes. Jasmine reached for Malik's hand. Alexander felt his pulse quicken. Then the director began reading. The probability of biological paternity is greater than 99.99%. For a moment, nobody moved. The words hung in the air as if the room itself needed time to understand them. Then reality arrived all at once. Alexander closed his eyes briefly. Years of unanswered questions suddenly became one undeniable truth. Across the table sat his son. Jasmine covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. Not tears of victory, tears of relief. Relief that the truth could no longer be denied. Malik looked between the adults, trying to understand the emotional weight of what had just happened. "What does that mean?" he asked quietly. The laboratory director smiled gently. "It means Alexander Grant is your biological father." The room fell silent again, this time for an entirely different reason. Several relatives stared at the document in disbelief. Others lowered their heads, remembering the assumptions they had made only days earlier. Victoria remained motionless. The confident certainty she had displayed at the birthday party had vanished completely. Alexander slowly stood. He walked around the table and stopped beside Malik. The boy looked up at him. Neither knew exactly what to say. No business success. No billion-dollar deal. No public recognition had ever prepared Alexander for this moment. Finally, he spoke. "I am sorry it took so long to find you." Malik studied his face for several seconds. Then he asked the question that mattered most. "You really are my dad?" Alexander nodded. "Yes, I am." A small smile appeared on Malik's face. It was simple, genuine, the kind of smile that carried no resentment and no judgment. In that instant, Alexander understood something important. The DNA test had revealed more than biology. It had revealed everything that had been stolen from them over the past 9 years. And as the meeting continued, another truth was about to emerge. The former employee who had recently come forward was ready to explain exactly who had hidden Jasmine's messages all those years ago and why. The room remained silent after the DNA results until the family's attorney invited the former estate employee to speak. Her name was Eleanor Briggs, and she had worked at the Grant estate for nearly 15 years before retiring. She sat across from the family, visibly nervous but determined. "I should have spoken sooner," she said. "I regret that every day." Everyone listened carefully. Eleanor explained that 9 years earlier she had personally seen letters addressed to Alexander arrive at the estate while he was traveling frequently for work. Some of those letters came from Jasmine Carter. She remembered them because the envelopes had been marked urgent. According to Eleanor, the letters never reached Alexander. Instead, they were intercepted and removed before he returned home. The room grew still. Nobody needed to ask who had the authority to do that. Victoria lowered her eyes. For the first time since the truth began emerging, she did not attempt to defend herself. Tears slowly formed in her eyes. "I thought I was protecting my family," she admitted quietly. "I convinced myself that I was doing the right thing." Alexander looked at his mother with a mixture of disappointment and sadness. Nearly a decade of missed birthdays, missed school events, missed conversations, and missed memories could never be recovered. Yet he also saw something he had never seen before. Genuine remorse. Victoria turned toward Jasmine. "I was wrong," she said. "I judged you before I knew you." I judged your son before I knew him. I am deeply sorry. Jasmine listened without interruption. No apology could erase the past, but she could hear the sincerity in Victoria's voice. Beside her, Malik watched quietly. The adults were discussing events that had shaped his entire life, yet he remained remarkably calm. Perhaps because children often focus less on what was lost and more on what can still be gained. Over the following weeks, changes came slowly but steadily. Alexander began spending time with Malik whenever possible. They visited museums, attended basketball games, and worked together on science projects. There were awkward moments and difficult conversations, but there was also laughter. Real laughter. The kind that comes when two people stop trying to force a relationship and simply allow it to grow. One Saturday afternoon, Alexander helped Malik build a model bridge for a regional school competition. When the project finally stood on its own, Malik grinned and said, "I guess engineering runs in the family." Alexander laughed and realized it was the first time his son had casually referred to them as family. The moment stayed with him for days. Several months later, the Grant family gathered once again at the estate. This time, the atmosphere was completely different. There were no accusations, no secrets, and no closed doors. During dinner, Victoria stood and raised her glass. Her voice trembled slightly. "I spent too many years believing that protecting my family meant controlling the future. I was wrong. Family is built on truth." Then she looked directly at Malik. "And I would like to say something I should have said the very first day I met you." The room became silent. A warm smile appeared on her face. "Welcome to the family, my grandson." Malik smiled. Jasmine quietly wiped away a tear. Alexander placed a hand on his son's shoulder. In that moment, nobody cared about wealth, inheritance, or the Grant name. What mattered was something far more valuable. After years of misunderstanding, the truth had finally found its way home.
Before you go, take a moment to reflect. Malik, who never asked for power, money, or a place in a wealthy family. He only deserved truth. Sometimes the greatest injustice is not what people say to us, but what they choose to hide. Victoria believed she was protecting her family, but fear disguised as protection became a prison. A father lost years he could never get back, a child who grew up without an answer, and a mother who carried all the burden in silence. Yet, truth is patient. It can be delayed, buried, and denied. But eventually, it will find its way to the surface. Instead of choosing bitterness, indifference, or deny, Malik, Alexander, and Victoria choose honesty, forgiveness, and a second chance. Because family isn't built from wealth, reputation, or control. It's built on truth, responsibility, and love. So if this story touched your heart, remember this: the person who needs the answer most are often the one with the quiet voice. If you like this video, like, share, and subscribe. And see you on the next story.